Welcome to the importance of data in veterinary health. And we are chatting with Clint Latham here today. My name is Daniel Valdez from Celeritas Digital. We are hosting monthly peer discussion webinars, just getting the best people in the veterinary industry that we can find to talk about their passion topics and have a back and forth discourse with people in the industry too. Our goals are just to share ideas, learn, and I know that Clint has a passion for educating as well. And so I just want to introduce Clint, who so kindly agreed to present and facilitate today. He's the founder of Aluka Veterinary Data Security. And Clint, I think no one can introduce you as well as you can. So if you want to share your
Sure. Yeah.
can introduce
Well,
yourself.
thanks. Thank you guys. I appreciate you guys being here. Um, yeah, so I guess I'll start here. You know when you can see my screen. 4,680 weeks. It's the average lifespan of a human being. So why in vet data? Why the hell would I even be talking about this general question? 4,680 weeks. I think the biggest question is how many weeks do you have left? And I think why this is really important is that the fact that you're about to give me some of your time is probably the most valuable thing in the world, more than your money, more than anything else. And so this isn't about me, it's about you guys, the few of you that are here. The more questions you have and the more value you have, or if there's something I can share or help you guys with, please let me know, because really it's all about you and how I can help you, especially in this insanely limited amount of time we have together, and giving me such a valuable resource. So who am I? Daniel did a great job introducing me. I'm the founder of Aluka Veterinary Data Security. If we're connected on LinkedIn, the only social media profile I use. You'll see my tagline is helping vets realize the value of their data and then helping them to protect it. I think this is kind of important. We'll get into a few of those things why I think that's important. The founder of Aluka Veterinary Data Security. We oversee all the technology for about a little over 227 hospitals across the United States and Canada. I've got over 15 years of software networking experience. I have a bachelor's degree in information technology. I also graduated from law school. So that's enough about how awesome I am, I guess. I hate talking about myself. Yeah, so I would say that in like the 8 years I've been involved in veterinary medicine, these have been my greatest teachers. The two little guys on the left are two Yorkies. If you've had Yorkies, they're 5 pounds of pure terrier. And the little black and tan one, Cash, he actually was diagnosed with TCC, so transitional cellular carcinoma. I think why this is, it was also a blessing, but it was also a curse in some regards, because at the time our GP had given him like 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks before it would spread so much in the trichome of his bladder that he wouldn't be able to urinate anymore, and we'd likely have to put him down. However, it was a bit of a blessing because at the time I was really getting my feet going in veterinary medicine, and I had an amazing team from my GP to our oncologist to even here in Colorado, a cannabis specialist, and just a nutritionist, a whole amazing amount of people. And I really got to see the power of when you can work with a team that's dedicated to one goal and you have a bunch of different specialties in vet med, the power that you can do. So we turned like 4 to 6 weeks into 18 months of really good quality of life. And we actually say that we beat the cancer because he was on an oral steroid. It was kind of like an oral chemo. It was just really hard on his old man kidneys. So his kidneys shut down, but the cancer had stopped spreading. So we always say we beat the cancer, and it was just his old man kidneys that couldn't keep up at the end of the day. We have since moved on from the Yorkies. They have crossed the Rainbow Bridge. We've moved into the large dog breed market now, I like to say. So we went from 5 pounds to 30 pounds. We now have Odin. He is a Woodle, so he's a soft-coated Wheaten Terrier Poodle mix. We've gone full into the designer poodle breeds. And going from terriers to the poodle breed mix, like, he's just the sweetest dog. He loves everybody. Like, I could put him in a kennel full of kids and he's just amazing. So yeah, but again, my greatest teachers in veterinary medicine, they've taught me so much about just the importance of good quality vet care. So I don't have a whole lot of slides here, so we're just gonna touch on a couple of things. I think when we look at the general whole picture of data in veterinary medicine, the most important, important thing is that it's the data in the hospital. It's the heartbeat of every business. So whenever I do a cybersecurity lecture or I'm talking about migrating to the cloud, etc., at any of the conferences, the number one question I ask is like, well, how long can you go without access to the data, right? So how long could you go without access to your PIMS? Most people will tell me around 10 minutes max, right? But a lot of times their needs don't necessarily match how they treat or protect the data or how they even think about it, right? So they understand there's this weird dynamic in vet med where it's like we understand the importance of all the data that we collect just to operate and function our business. But then we have this weird other side that I think we'll dig into where it's like, but who wants Fluffy's medical records, right? I think I hear this all the time. I think for most hospitals, I think the truth would shock them. And actually, ironically enough, it's great that we have Chris here because I wanted to use Vet Verify as an example in this actually. So when I had met a couple of the other guys on the team, one thing that we had talked about, and so it's not just outside threat actors that we have to worry about. I feel that we also have to worry about inside threat actors. And one thing that really struck me about Verify and why I think we connected so well is that David was like, you know, what's fascinating is when we started connecting to the practice management system, a lot of the, you know, it was like, oh, we'll just give you everything. And it's like, no, we don't want everything. We don't need everything. Like we just need vaccination records, right? Like that's what we're trying to do. And it's the only thing we're trying to do. And in the veterinary medicine, in vet med, there's this weird trend where I think for so long it has just been, well, we're creating this service, we're going to do this one little thing, but we're going to just pull all of your data and we're just going to take everything. And it just seems to be the norm. I think that is slowly changing. I think with great companies like Vet Verify, like Digital, some other cloud-based PIMs that are coming out that are saying like, no, you're telling us your service is X. If you want to connect, your data is going to be limited to X, right? Because that's what we're going to be transparent about in this whole conversation. So one thing that we generally do, like when we take on a new hospital to help manage them from a technology standpoint, is we'll look at the data connectors that are running on their server or what other services they have. Now, I won't say because it's recorded and just because I know a lot of these other companies that I may not be a huge fan of, like they probably have legal teams that could really take me down. But if anybody's curious off camera, I'd be more than happy to tell you some of our least favorite organizations and some data connectors that were made like, we got to get this off. If you don't think, if I tell you about what we know is actually going on, if you don't see the overall benefit compared to what data you're giving them and what they're doing with it, then I think we should uninstall it and we should remove it right away. I actually just had this conversation yesterday with another hospital in North Carolina. And so I think it's not just outside threat actors. That is a problem. And we have plenty of examples of hospitals like getting attacked, et cetera, from a cybersecurity standpoint. But I think we have this other lurking problem that nobody's really aware of. And it's just kind of the rampant data theft within veterinary medicine. And nobody really cares because it comes back to this idea again of like, oh, well, who wants Fluffy's vaccination records? Or who really cares if, you know, somebody sees that Fluffy's on heartworm? I think the truth is if we look at the other side of it, which is like the cybersecurity side of things, I think on the dark web, we saw the other day that a bunch of schools on the East Coast, elementary schools, their student records data was basically exfiltrated and compromised, and it sold on the dark web for it was like $250,000. So why the heck would anybody want middle school data and be willing to pay such a premium for it, right? I think the truth is that we know that data is more valuable than gold. What the person's end goal with it was, I have no idea. You know, maybe it was a means to an ends, right? It's like, well, we see all these children going to this specific school in this district. We can then get an idea of income and then potentially their parents, and then this can lead us to greater means or whatever that is. But the truth is, so now imagine what the value is for an entire business, right? A medical business. What kind of value does that data have? And I think it's really, really, there's a lot of data there, or a lot of value there, and we don't realize it a lot of times until it's too late. So I know I've said a lot there. Any questions on any of this or any thoughts around any of this? I'm getting on my soapbox and I don't want to go too long here.
No, I completely agree. I see it from, a different side working, with animal health sales companies and the way that they relate to veterinary clinics and their data. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the data is gold, and whatever use the data is for, that's completely beside the point. I think that protecting the data and knowing what you're doing with it uh, in your clinic is super important. So I 100% agree.
Awesome. The importance of data protection. This is probably like my biggest area of expertise and something I think about all the time and try to help people with. I mean, we're really kind of focused on like, how do we help veterinary practices understand that a lot of times they're the path of least resistance. And so what do I mean that by? A lot of, it goes back to the original question of most hospitals are like, why would anybody want, from an outside threat perspective, if we look at it from this perspective, why would anybody want to attack my little hospital in small town Iowa, right? And what they don't realize is that it's not like, if I'm a hacker, yeah, I'm not going to spend the time to invest to just go after you, right? It's not going to be worth my time. But what I am going to do is I'm going to build a tool that I'm going to deploy to the World Wide Web. And if you're the path of least resistance, you best believe I'm coming after you, because it's going to be easy. And actually in 2019, the AVMA started releasing their own cybersecurity PLIT insurance. And I actually sat in on one of their webinars, and the guy that they had hired from, I think, like the human medical space, who was involved in cybersecurity, he had this great analogy, and he called it the waterfall approach. And essentially the way a cyber attack is actually deployed is like a waterfall. So if you look at a river, it just follows the path of least resistance, right? And then the path of least resistance just over the edge of the cliff, and then it continues on. And so in most hospitals, it doesn't really matter, like they don't really care how much money you make or how big you are. Really, the only thing that they care about is, again, back to my original point, is that they know you can only go 5 to 10 minutes without access to your data. And so if they can lock you out of it, steal it, do a whole bunch of other things, and we got a million examples of things that we've seen, that you're more than likely you're going to pay them, right? I think back at the time, the AVMA's average cybersecurity incident claim was around $250,000. So it's been 4 years now, so I can only imagine with inflation what those costs currently are. So if you think about that, $250,000 that you're going after. And if you look at most hospitals, say they're a $2 million practice, they're working really hard to be 20% profitable, which we know is generally not the case. That's all of the money you've made, right? If you don't have insurance and you don't have something to cover it. I think another thing that I think is becoming another problem back to like our industry as a whole, if we look at a lot of the big players in the cloud practice management space, none of them really take cybersecurity all that important. They may have some like structure on the back end where they're using Amazon Web Services or Google Web Services or whatever. They may have some basic kind of standard good practices in place when it comes to how those systems are protected. But we have seen time and time again where essentially a hospital will be cloud-based, their general email accounts get compromised, they don't know it. That person then uses that account to help figure out what software they're using, maybe what some of the logins are, maybe hop from one account to another. Then from there, once they figure out how essentially they can log in from Bangladesh or wherever into the practice management system, because there's no controls around it. There's no basic things like 2FA for our logins. They log in. Generally what they'll do is they will then export all of the invoices over the last like six month period, and they have your entire customer set. And then they start emailing them from your account, because they already have access to it, saying like, hey, the day that you came in for, and I'll use me as an example, your Yorkie was here getting his 12 teeth pulled, because Yorkies have terrible teeth. He had this $1,200 bill. Our credit card machines were down. It actually wasn't able to run. Can you please pay through this pay link for us? And I mean, it's coming from the hospital email. It's the actual invoice. So it's like, it looks legit. Now, there's no way for us to generally know how many people have fallen victim to it, but I can tell you it creates a massive, massive PR issue for the hospital, right? Because now it looks like, why is my vet calling me? And then you realize that, oh, all of my information has now been stolen. And so what kind of, how good does that look for your hospital, right? How many customers do you potentially lose because now they've basically essentially been taken advantage of? So I think this is another overarching problem in the vet med space, especially as we're seeing more and more hospitals going cloud-based. You can essentially access it from anywhere. I think if you really push and pull on some of these practice management systems, you can get general IP or location lockdowns in place. And the sad thing is that a lot of times around the IP address location lockdown is it's been more about like we don't want our employees like logging in or checking in from home, right? With like time clock stuff. And it's never really like, well, what about the guy that maybe, is in the Bahamas that's going to steal all your customer records and then potentially blackmail you, right? So we don't think about those things. We think about it internally rather than the greater picture. I think this is a major problem and a major thing that hopefully we can change. We do see some of the systems like Digitail has a really cool thing called typing DNA, because 2FA can be a total pain in the butt, right? Like especially with shared accounts in hospitals with tech accounts and all these other things, it can be really hard to have 2FA, right? Because where are you going to get that rolling code? So with Digitail, they essentially have, when you first set a user up and they go to log in, they type like 50 to 100 words. And typing DNA behind the scenes creates a profile based on how they type. So how quickly they type between certain letters, how hard they press the keys. Essentially, it's a fingerprint based on how you type. And so when you log in and you type your password in, it actually 2FAs you and authenticates you as well. So like I run typing DNA on all of my computers. They have like a local computer application. So if somebody walked up to my computer, so Daniel, if you walked up to my computer and tried to use it, it would immediately lock you out because it would see that you don't have my typing fingerprint, essentially. So there are some really cool ways, and there are some cloud systems that are thinking about these greater problems that we can change and implement, but I think we're still years away, and it's just a major problem that unfortunately we're going to have to we're kind of the people that try to help clean up the pieces from this, but that's going to be a big problem. And then I think the next piece, if we look at data as a whole in vet med, is the data laws and privacies. And honestly, I think this goes back to the other side of it. When we look at different vendors and organizations always trying to connect to our database, is it really, it's the wild, wild west, right? When it comes to, we don't have HIPAA, we don't have any of these other controls where we have like business user agreements, et cetera, between parties and like really strict controls. We have basic things like GDPR, which I think does a great thing for consumer protection. But again, that's in Europe, right? Another reason, I know I talk about Digitail a lot, but one of the reasons that I like them is because they started in Europe and they maintained their GDPR process in the United States, even though they don't have to. So there are a lot of great things, I think, around GDPR. In the United States, we have CCPA, which started in California in 2020 around the COVID pandemic. And it's the California Consumer Protection Act, similar to GDPR in a lot of ways, but also worse in a lot of ways. With GDPR, you have to get consent for everything, right? If I'm going to do anything with your data, I have to get consent first. With CCPA, it's pretty much like, hey, if you have questions, you can ask us, and then we have to tell you, right? And then you have like opt-out rights. So the other interesting thing is like when I started this company, we knew CCPA was coming down the pipe. We knew that GDPR was about to be released. And so we started interviewing a lot of hospitals, like, do you even know what these are? Do you know what these laws are that are coming down the pipe? And nobody had any idea, right? So I think that's the other piece in vet med is they think like, well, we don't have HIPAA, so really it doesn't matter. But I think now with over 16 other states adopting CCPA, there are some legal ramifications if you were to get compromised. So generally we have to think about it the easiest way, and this is a very, very, very oversimplification of how the laws work, and there's some more nuance to it. But generally, if you can triangulate a person, so like if I can get into your practice management system and I can individualize Clint Latham in Palisade, Colorado from Clint Latham in Chicago, Illinois, that's data that you have to protect, right? And if you don't take reasonable measures to protect that data, there are some legal liabilities. We also know that like Senator Warren and some other senators are also working on, because it was like just after the Biden administration had taken over, we saw all these just like massive ransomware attacks hitting all businesses, right? We saw like all the big ones, the oil and gas, the big food company, but a bunch of small companies were getting hit too. And so at the time they're like, oh, how do we go about, helping businesses? And rather than actually helping us, they're actually just putting more red tape in place, right? So if you get hit with ransomware, there's going to be a bunch of government notification requirements that you then have to submit to the United States government while you're trying to just put your business back together. So nobody in the cybersecurity space thinks that this legislation that they're proposing is any good. We think it kind of shames the victim rather than actually trying to help people. but those are other things that are kind of coming down the pipe. And the thing is most cases, I mean, obviously, I feel like the IDEXs, the Covettruses, the BIs, the Zoetises of the world, they have massive legal teams that are aware of all this stuff. But at the individual hospital level, I think most hospitals are completely oblivious to actually some of the general things they need to do to make sure that they're protecting their client data and the potential liability and notification and all this stuff. And I think that's why we see whenever there is a cyber incident, a lot of times those claims are so high because of all the things you have to do once you've been hit. So the next piece, I think another interesting area with data in veterinary medicine is just the challenge of standardization in vet med. And Chris, you're probably all aware of this. It's trying to pull data and working with the Bitworks team on like getting data from the hospital. And I think this is why, Vet Data or Bitworks or ACT or all these companies are, they have such wide success is because it is such a nightmare. Because we don't have we don't have insurance coding like we do in human medicine. Nothing is coded the same, right? So every hospital is different. And this creates for a massive problem in us really trying to leverage the power of looking at trends and some of the things that I think where we can really go with data in the future and some really cool things that we could potentially do. But I think one of the biggest challenges is there's no standardization. Like AHA came out with their like AHA chart of accounts, but it is so deep and so complicated. A majority of hospitals don't implement it, right? Like it's just too much for them. And they're like, nah, we've kind of got it our own way. So I think this lack of like everything being coded and built in different ways creates for a massive problem in us actually being able to leverage the power in vet med. And I think, with other data standardization companies like Bitworks or ACT or some of these other players in the market, I'm not sure if Covetrus is doing much with vet data anymore, but I think those companies, if they can really work, they're already working, but the better we can make those tools that can sort out and look at all these different coding issues to kind of standardize it, I think that's where we can then leverage as a community and as a team to figure out how we can literally leverage the power of big data, right? Because right now we're not really in a big data perspective unless you're pushing all of your data unknowingly to Covetrus or whoever, right? You're using their backup, their data vaults, and we can talk about that. That's a whole other problem, like we saw in the Covetrus breach in 2019. But as a whole, I think standardization creates a massive problem in vet med. So what kind of impact does that have? I mean, if you talk to anybody, any hospital that has tried to migrate from a legacy system like Cornerstone, Avamark, Impromed, and some of the other random ones are out there, like Intravet, there's like, was it like, I can't remember some of the other like DV Max and some of these other ones, you will realize that a lot of times most hospitals are like, oh, we're just going to migrate and then we're going to shut the server off. If you're an Impromed customer, that is so hard to get the data out of Infinity Impromed a lot of times that server then sits around for 6 months to a year, so you can always reference historical data. Now, in most cases with Cornerstone or like Avamark, generally we see data migrations going decently well, and you can generally, you only have to go back for minor things, right? Like maybe we missed a charge for maybe we're missing the right charge for heartworm or whatever in the system. And so we have to go back and get some like inventory costs, or maybe we're missing a few invoices, etc. But generally it's still a very manual process when getting everything from one system to another. And I think this again just talks about the lack of non-standardization in vet med and the challenges that presents. Yeah, I guess kind of finish up on that thought. So I think that's where AI comes in. I think we're seeing a massive trend in a lot of companies wanting to leverage the power of AI. And what does that mean? I think if we can get to a point where we do have more standardization, or we have companies that are working really hard that make the standardization a lot easier. And then if we can aggregate a lot of that data, I always like to use a trade or cash as an example. So at the time, if I would have went to my GP and he'd been like, okay, so I see a massive tumor in the trichome of his bladder and in his prostate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask AI, a part of whatever, and I'll use Digitail as an example because they're doing this in some regards already. I'm going to ask Tails if there are any other doctors across the world that have seen a 14-year-old Yorkie with this advanced level of TCC, and I'm going to ask it to give me the top 3 treatment plans with the best outcomes across the globe. So in an instant, you can interview hundreds of thousands of your colleagues in a matter of seconds. And it will then tell you the treatment plans that were most successful. It could even, depending upon, generally speaking, I think there needs to be a lot of controls around how that data looks, and we'll talk about the risk, but potentially telling you what doctor it was, how long ago it was. So then at that point, you could pick up the phone and be like, hey, I just got a result that you worked with this Yorkie. Can you tell me how you were so successful? Can you give me some more insights as to what you think made this case or these cases that you've worked on, this treatment plan so successful? And so now imagine, I think it can completely revolutionize quality of life, quality of care. We're not going to be limited to just, our own thoughts, really the power of big data. And I think this could, I really hope someday we can reach this point. But for me, as kind of a bit of a, as Sebastian will tell you, I'm a bit of a contrarian when it comes to AI and a lot of big tech stuff. I think there are a lot of controls and some things we need to put in place first. But I think, even now we are seeing with AI, you can go in and be like, hey, give me the weight history over the last 6 months. What's the trajectory been like? Give me the blood panel results over the last, how have their BUN and creatinine levels changed over the last 6 months? Is it getting better? Is it getting, instead of having to go back and review that stuff manually, you can ask these LLMs these simple questions and it will just give you all the data. So I think we're seeing those small things coming in. I think the real power is once we can come together as a community to really say like, hey, how can we leverage the power of this data for better treatment plans, is going to be super powerful. I think in human medicine, we are already seeing the point in like radiology scans, CT scans, where we're having AI scan a lot of these, that it's almost going to become malpractice, I think, in the next 2 years in human med if you aren't running scans through AI, right? Like if somebody goes in for a CT scan or an X-ray or whatever, if you're not having AI read it, I think there will be a potential for malpractice because of how accurate and how quickly you can get results back. There is a company that I've actually have been connected with for a long time that was really, really early on in this, Vetology AI. I think they were like the first kind of real AI company, but they understood that even then, if the AI potentially found something out of whack that they thought you needed to look at, they even backed it up by having their internal radiologist review it. So you could get like actual human eyes on it. But I think just the power of it being able to scan it in a second and give you information. We're seeing this trend in human medicine. It's not going to take long before it is almost, I think before it is a requirement. And so if we can really leverage those things, I think in veterinary medicine, it'll create massive changes. And then last but not least, when I think about AI as a whole, I think the biggest risk, and a lot of people, and Elon Musk had a statement, I think it was last year, where he was like, he felt the biggest risk was the non-democratization of AI, right? We don't know who controls the models. We don't know who we don't know, there's no transparency around it. A lot of people in the AI space would be like, well, that's because Elon's now mad that he sold his shares in OpenAI and Microsoft has taken over and he's not involved and now he wants to play catch up. So he's trying to get everybody to slow down. But I think he makes a really great point. I will use a very controversial example. So this may make you mad. It may make you excited. I don't know. That's not my goal. I think it's just a really good example of how the potential risks of AI and how we actually don't control that middle layer. And there are a bunch of filters there, and we have no idea who controls it and how it's written. So if you were to go to OpenAI and ChatGPT and you were to say, hey, I want you to write me a beautiful poem about what a great president Donald Trump was. It will give you a result that says, hey, I'm sorry, Donald Trump is a very controversial figure. I can't do that. AI, I'm not asking you for a political opinion, right? I am asking you to do something specific for me and I need the output. But there is a filter there that is then generating this response. If you go to it and you ask now, hey, do the same thing for Joe Biden, it will write the poem for you or it'll write a song for you. So this just goes to show you that there is controls there. Now, and in that example, in that extreme example, because politics is so polarizing, that may either make you extremely happy or it may make you really mad. I don't know. That's not the point of this. But what the point is that right now it may be okay in some examples for you, but what does that mean when we start trying to leverage the power in our own businesses? Or who has access to that middle layer and who has access to the AI? Like sometimes I think about what if you were to go on, we already know it's probably already happening to this day, but say you go on and you've got like a weird rash on your side and you go in and you're like, hey, AI, I've got this rash. It's about this big. can you tell me potentially what it is? Do I need to go get it checked out? Now, what if your insurance company has access to all of this data? It can then say like, oh, we see Clint searching for this rash. He may have something more serious going on. Maybe we need to increase his rates, right? Like what kind of privacy issues do we run into there? We also saw that Italy, they have since opened it back up, and I haven't heard why. There hasn't been a lot of clarity around this, but they for a while did ban ChatGPT. So ChatGPT wasn't allowed to be used anywhere in Italy because basically they're saying that OpenAI was what's breaking GDPR rules, right? So we know that a lot of these models are going to the open internet and just gathering a bunch of data to build their data models. And in this case, they're like, well, so you're gathering a bunch of personal information about people and storing that data without their consent, right? And so that was the big problem. We don't know how those things work. So I think the biggest problem for me when it comes to AI is, again, who controls those data sets? There's no transparency around it. There isn't this collective idea around it. For me, in like my utopian data future, we would all understand, and there would be a lot of transparency around how the data sets are collected, if we want to opt in or if we want to opt out, so that there's just real clarity on what's being collected about us and how it's being used. I think those are the biggest things. We do see in the personal space that some of the public is starting to become more aware of it because they're getting, like how often have you been sitting around and like talking about something, right? And then all of a sudden, like in my case, I'm about to go skiing in Japan. So it's like me, my wife, and I are talking about the trip, and then all of a sudden I'm getting these ads for like Japan tourism, right? Like we know our devices are constantly listening to us. And so I think people are starting to pick up on this and they're starting to get, basically they're starting to be like, I'm not sure about a lot of this. So we have seen in like the personal marketplace where companies are now saying like, hey, if you're willing to share some information with me, I will give you a financial benefit as in some discount in return, right? And in that case where it's like, maybe a ski company like, hey, we think that if you want to share with us your potential history, you're here. If there's something we have and in stock, we'll give you 10% off to buy it right now. So they're like this potential give and it's a two-way street. I'm giving you data, but I'm getting something in return. There is a great organization that's based in Silicon Valley, and I am drawing a blank on what they're called, but they're pushing really hard on like trying to create some ethics around how we collect data and how we use data, especially with AI coming down the pipe. So with that being said, I think I'm right at the 40-minute mark almost. That is my soapbox about everything in data and vet med. A lot of my concerns, some of the cool things I think we can do, some of the challenges I think we face. If you haven't, I have a free ebook you can download. It's called 5 Simple Steps to Protect Your Practice. Please download it. I worked really hard to try to make it really pretty. It's free. There's no spam in there. And it'll give you 5 things that you can implement in your practice that kind of will shore up most of your probably your biggest issues or gaps to make you not the path of least resistance when it comes to a cyber attack. And most of them are either free or very, very little cost, maybe a couple of dollars a month that you can implement in your practice over a couple of days. So you can download that if you want. There's also my contact information if you have any questions about anything technology related or data or IT in vet med. I'm happy to help in any way that I can.
Thank you so much, Clint. And do you mind if I put your LinkedIn perhaps in the chat?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You? Let's do that. And while we're doing that, I just wanted to say something that came to mind while you were discussing, you, you know, AI in particular and the changes there. I've just noticed that as technology has increased, the options for taking control of your privacy, even if it's available to you, it's so much more challenging. And this is just something I've been thinking about as, from a personal standpoint and from a professional standpoint. But I'm curious to know what you think about how that will evolve in the future and ways
Yeah.
to address the challenges and exhaustive ways in which we have to take control of our privacy.
Yeah, it's going to be, I mean, unfortunately, I would love to be an optimist, but again, I'm a bit of a contrarian when it comes to this stuff. I'll own up to that. I think it's going to be really, really hard. I actually gave a talk at WVC last year, and it was essentially maintaining a sense of privacy in an era of a permanent record. I kind of stole that title from, I think, one of the greatest data privacy people out there, Edward Snowden. He wrote a really great book. If you haven't read it, I think it's definitely well worth the read. I mean, the guy gave up everything. He gave up the perfect life to let us know that our government was spying on us. So I think, and that was decades, that was over 10 years ago, right? And we essentially knew that the United States government was not only listening to every phone call we were making, but they also have their own essentially firewall at each ISP, right? So at every backbone, the United States government is essentially looking at all of your web traffic. Now, I don't think those firewalls have gone away. Just because Edward Stone told us that they were there, they didn't go in and uninstall them, right? We know that they're still there. We know that there's also a thing at the NSA, if you're an employee there, where if you go on a date, they essentially, before they go on a date with you, they will joke with their employees and look up anything and everything about you to figure out who they're gonna go meet before they will. And there's like a term for it. That got leaked by a reporter a while ago. So the fact is there's a amazing amount of data that's out there about us. Right now, it takes somebody to actually analyze that data. I think now that's the power of AI, right? It has the power to analyze massive amounts of data sets insanely quickly. I don't think AI is going to replace people's jobs in the near future. I think somebody who can use AI really well will start taking a lot of people's jobs. And I think that's because you will become so insanely efficient. So back to your piece, it's like there are so many data points that are being collected on us all the time. And now when you couple that with the power of AI to instantly analyze that information, I mean, you're really going to have no privacy, essentially. I think is no matter what controls you put in. Like I use a third-party service that constantly goes around and scrubs all my information and uses laws and stuff that are in place in different states and where those companies reside to basically scrub my personal information from their data sets. I think maybe companies like that will become more important, and I get a report every once in a while, and sometimes I'll even get emails from them like, hey, thanks for the request, but we don't have to delete it. And then you have to jump through hoops to get them to actually delete your data. So I would love to say that, yeah, it's going to become easier, but I think it's going to become harder. Unless Europe with GDPR, they made good steps in like trying to help people have some rights over what data was collected on them. And we have seen a lot of massive billion-dollar fines come down on organizations that weren't doing the right thing. So there is hope. I think it's going to be harder. I think it's going to be, who knows, right? I think if anything, the people with all the data, again, I think that's back to my other point, that people who control the data set, I mean, they're the ones that are going to have all the power.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point. I feel like I'm lagging a little bit. One second. I have another question, but I want to wait until I'm not lagging.
No problem.
Uh, yeah, I just also encourage anyone else who has any questions or any points to make it, feel free to add in. Um,
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, Quint.
Yeah,
On the data privacy law side of things, you mentioned the CCPA,
yeah,
and you said 16 other states have adopted similar legislation.
yeah.
I have a good resource that like kind of keeps track or summarizes that kind of state adoption side of things.
Do you have one, or are you looking
Do
for one?
you, yeah, I
Oh
was
yeah, there
curious
is.
if you have.
I will I don't know what it is off of hand. I did bookmark it somewhere because it is constantly changing.
Yeah,
I think the thing with it is most states, it's very similar. If they didn't adopt basically the exact same language, it's very similar. Or they have made minor changes. So there may be subtle differences from state to state.
yeah,
But I can pull that up and I can send it to you after. I'll find it because I do have it somewhere. But there is one that it even has a map that shows you all the states, and ones that are pending and thinking about adopting it.
lovely. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was also wondering from a software development standpoint, how can we communicate data privacy and security better to our clients? I know that the literacy there,
Yeah.
it's not there, and to convince someone that your data is safe and protected is equally as hard when the literacy is not there. So I'm
Yeah,
curious.
that and and like understanding both sides of it, right? Because from a legal perspective, you have to have all the legalese there, right? I mean, because if you don't, I mean, you essentially got to prepare for the worst and then hope for the best with any contract. And actually that I had dreams of grandeur, like where I loved contract law and I wanted to like move to the Bay Area and like ride bikes and do like contract law. That was like my dreams. And then I fell in love with vet med and here I am. So much for that. But I do like, we have to have EULAs, we have to have all these things in place, right? Like end user license agreements, etc. But I think a lot of times, I think if we can have simple plain in English, which is really hard to work with your legal team, right? If you're like, hey, and actually Martin, Vet Success, Martin and I have hashed it out a lot on this, like this whole data conversation piece, because he came from a place where was building a tool and I kind of had different views on how things should go about. So Martin and I have always kind of clashed about this conversation. But one thing I think Martin did really well is that, and he will admit too, that it was really hard to get his legal team to approve, is that they had a section on their website that was in plain English. It's like, this is what happens with your data. And again, coming from a legal standpoint, I understand why, right? Because somebody could then go to that in a court case and be like, this is what you said, but this happened. And there's so much gray area that it could create problems. But he at least had, he had the moral fortitude to be like, no, this is something we need and it's something really important. So I think the more we can push for those kind of just general, as much as we can get in plain English so it's easy for people to see what we're doing. I think that's a big piece of it. I think the other thing, and even maybe something simpler, like easier, is just only like to Chris and his team, like just doing what's right, right? I mean, a lot of times we have to have all the legalese in point. But a lot of times, instead of like hiding behind the EULA, like if you look at the Covetrus data breach from 2019, I had to talk about that at VHMA because they were asking about it. There was like a track record of their user agreement changing like 5 times over that, like over like a 4-month period or whatever it was. And don't quote me on that. I don't remember what it is, but it was like over a quick succession amount of time, the EULA had changed multiple times about who had access to the data, how they were sharing it. And so a lot of times it's like, well, we're doing things because technically in the EULA that you don't understand and you'll never take the time to read, we can. But I think it comes back to us in the technology space of actually just doing the right thing, right? Like, let's just do what we're going to say. Let's provide a value and a service back to the hospital like we say we're going to do, and not be greedy and, like do things kind of shady behind the scenes. I think that's probably the easiest thing to do, right? Is just to do what you're actually saying you're going to do, and then have all the legal protections in there to play and to help you in case the worst thing does come about. That's probably the easiest thing. The hard thing is that I think there's just been this trend in vet med where it's like, well, they've always given us all the data, so why won't you, right? Yeah, we technically don't need it, but we like having it. And it's like, well, maybe you don't need it. Maybe you should actually focus on this product or service you're trying to offer and then think about the rest.
Absolutely, I agree. So I think getting more focused and targeted in what you're asking for helps.
Yeah.
From a software development side. And then I think if your goals are good faith and it'll be easier to communicate, because I have taken that route as well, aside from all of the regular protections in places, just to put something in plain English so people can understand.
Absolutely.
What are we doing with the data and how are we protecting you?
Yeah.
And so I have to agree. I'm glad that you're bringing up some of these points, but I'm curious from different perspectives. Rachel, are you? I hate to pick on people, but I didn't get exactly what your position is in the industry.
So I'm an associate professor at Veterinary College, but I'm a second career professor. I spent the first 10 years in information technology before throwing it all away and going to vet school. I'm also a past president of the Association for Veterinary Informatics. So that's probably, I guess, my more proximate connection. I would say that my interest is probably not that I'm disinterested in privacy and data security, but my greatest interest would probably be roughly around slide 11 or so, where we talk about leveraging data to be better doctors. And so I definitely have feelings and opinions on that, but I'm not sure that that's going to be congruent with where the conversation's going.
Actually, so I do have a question for you on that piece, where I think where it's interesting. Like if you look at Banfield, right? Like they had built their own PIMS, and then they had kind of like you as a new doctors seem to love it, right? Because they could go in and put in basic symptoms, it developed a treatment plan for them, and kind of gave them a roadmap. But then it seemed like after a while, a lot of doctors were then like, yeah, but I feel like I'm losing the art of medicine, right? Like there's like an intuition and a feel of like having worked with a patient for so long that maybe the treatment plan will give me, but I don't really have the nuance of kind of being a medical artist, for lack of a better term, is kind of the term we hear a lot. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think with the power of data, yes, I think that there is a lot of amazing things to look for trends and things that maybe we might miss, but do we lose the art of being a doctor?
Yes, I don't consider myself an artist. Although I will say that probably it's very reinforcing and very powerful to, I think, feel that you're sort of being an artist. So I certainly understand why that would be a compelling desire. I will say that many veterinary artists I know are not particularly data driven. And in fact, I'd have to say I didn't exactly completely love the example you gave with the transitional cell carcinoma, where you say, what's the most common thing that's done? Because I can tell you in my experience, when I look and see what's common, it's not always well supported by the evidence. And I think that we would start to lose the ability to move the field forward if we sort of say just what's commonly done now. The other thing that we are really, I would say, really struggling with, not only with sort of coding, you know, as you mentioned quite correctly, of course, not having the diagnosis and problem codes. Well, when we have them, there's just nobody uses them, and I think that that's not a winning battle. Although maybe we can probably get AI. I've worked a bit with Scribble Vet folks and on coding, and it's been kind of coding via AI, and it's been quite interesting. To see what it does well and what it does not do well. So I think that could be a future. What I would say is I don't think we've developed well ways to code outcomes. If you go and you look at like SNOMED, all of the outcome codes are incredibly specific to conditions. And you can see that makes sense, right? If you broke a leg, my outcomes that I care about as a doctor are going to be very different than if you sustain maybe a brain injury. Right. And I suppose you could be like doing better or not doing better in general for medical conditions. But if you sort of look at benchmarks for what I hope you to achieve after I've done surgery on your broken leg versus saved you from your traumatic brain injury, you can see why it'd be quite different. And that I'm not sure where that's going to come from. I mean, obviously with an AI, they can say, do we have another record here? Is the patient still alive? Maybe we can even parse some client communications. But I think that would be a real struggle because, of course, that's for me the holy grail, why I care about the data, because if I can look at all these things that we do and look at the outcomes, that would be incredibly powerful. And that's where I kind of see the outcomes coding is the huge gap, including from, again, even if we can get this AI and to sort of process these massive records. I will also say, I have done some relief work in a clinic that has wellness plans, and there was a polycythemia, a very serious condition that they should have caught 3 blood works ago, and nobody did. I don't know why not, but there also wasn't anything in the system that said, hey, weird, the number of red blood cells in this dog is climbing. And of course, you look at it every time, it's a little bit abnormal, a little bit more abnormal, but if you're not looking at the whole pattern, you don't see what's happening. So I don't know. I don't know if you blame the artist or if you blame the system in that one, but I definitely think we could use a little bit more system level observing, because that's quite disappointing if you're paying for this sort of wellness blood work, because they weren't bringing the dog in for signs of having too many red blood cells. They were bringing in for the package, right? And I'm like, how am I a relief vet finding this who's not even that great at medicine? So I'm more on the surgery side.
Right, yeah. And
So.
I guess one thing, I mean, I think you make a lot of valid points, and I will agree, like artist probably is not the right word, but just for the sake of my limited brain power is the only way I could think to describe it. When it comes to the power of data. But I also think, like, I guess my example with like TCC is not the most common treatments, but like in my case, I looked at every angle, right? I looked at every profession in vet med. So my thought is I think AI gives us the power to look at what you stated as the best outcomes, right? Like what had the best treatment outcomes, and can we then look at to give us the opportunity to then speak with the artist or the doctor in that case, be like, how is it that you had such great success in this outcome that maybe I'm not seeing or missing, or what are some minutiae that maybe I'm not getting on? I think that's where the power is, not necessarily looking at common traits, but I do think, and actually I'm not sure how much I can say about this. So how do I say this? I think there is a power to potentially have AI analyze trends based on certain data points, like in your case with the red blood cell thing, right? Like, are there certain markers or trends that we're seeing? And if we can grab subjective history from the pet parent, because we know like how different the animal reacts at home, right? With gait or certain things, right? They get in the hospital and then they're like, everything's fine, right? Because they're no longer there. So it's like, if we can figure out ways to grab the power of like the at-home issues and results and the subjective point of view from like the owner at home, coupled with like the data at the hospital. And then if we can use the power of AI to start looking at trends and things over a period of time, maybe it'll start gathering things that are underlying that maybe we don't miss. And I could be wrong about that because I'm not a doctor, but when I look at the data, I think there's some potential there.
No, I'm definitely quantified self, and my animals are medium quantified. I've got a meter that tracks how much they eat, and they got the
Oh, really?
watering that tracks how much they drink, and but
Interesting.
there's
So how are you collecting the data on like the food and water intake?
It's microchip linked, and I'm sure it's all stored very insecurely somewhere, but who wants this, right? No,
Yeah.
just kidding. Yeah, but there's nothing monitoring it that would say, oh, your cat's been decreasing their food intake over time. So it's still kind of, you're still in that situation where you have all this great data points, but if nobody's looking at them systematically,
Right.
only
Yeah.
in retrospect, where you're like, looks like we should have started bleeding your dog a year ago. So,
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like the tools you're using, so you said it's microchip based, but is there some sort of like does the bowl gather weight and then it measures the weight difference every time the microchip comes in within a certain proximity? Gotcha.
yeah, so it controls a lid because I have multiple cats, as cat owners tend to do. And so of course you're any of you who own cats are probably familiar. That means you end up with some fat cat and a skinny cat.
Yeah.
So this also helps to control that phenomena, as well as actually I bought it for that reason. And then sort of the tracking over time is just sort of a bonus. But then I ended up with a cat with some really bizarre blood dyscrasia, where she immune system kills all of her red blood cells episodically. So this is actually good because she does, you start to see this trend in her food intake before you would see it in other signs, especially because her mucous membranes are black, so or gray. But I mean, they're pigmented, so you can't just pop a little finger on there and say how you doing. Nice and pink still. So anyway, but I'm not leveraging that probably as well as I should have, because she drops her hair too, so that's a little easier to see.
So I have another question for you on that, because we actually were talking the other day with a company that uses from a telehealth perspective, from a human standpoint, like from a camera, it looks at different wavelengths in the pigment of the skin, and then it segments it out to 40 different points on the face, because there's different levels of light that will then reflect off the skin based on your respiratory rate, your heart rate, and your HRV. And so it segments that out, and then it creates and then it analyzes the data against an actual pulse oximeter or whatever, and then to get more accurate results to determine what their plus minus is. One question they had, and I don't know, but can you get those sorts of data points off? Could you potentially do telemed at home where you're looking at a dog or a cat's nose because it's not covered by hair? Or you mentioned their gums. That was one thing I thought of, was could you potentially scan their gums and look at the different wavelengths to get these basic parameters, or their eyes? Is there any potential from a medical standpoint of being able to do those sorts of things?
I will say the challenge is the hair coat, or as the fancy term is pelage. It has
What is the word?
pelage.
Pelage. Interesting. That's a new one for me.
It has different emissivity. It's quite, actually the emissivity is quite variable. So the little gun thermometers you point it around. These don't work well on them because you would I actually have a study on this, so I'm very excited to talk about it. So you'll have to pull me in because we're at the top of the hour, or at the top of the time. So you have to compensate for that emissivity, which is quite variable. The obviously non-haired surfaces, the cornea, and the gums, if you are so lucky enough to have an animal that will tolerate you
Yeah, exactly. Right.
around in there, would be the candidate areas. There's also some more lightly furred areas, especially if you have a Chihuahua, or tends to be in the sort of thorax area and things like that. But it would be a bit more complicated than humans, although humans have their own complication with the pigment, also variability. But in addition to pigment variability, they also have the hair coat. The properties of it are quite variable in terms of the emissivity if you're dealing with infrared. So
are you familiar with Mela Pet Care?
Mm-mm.
So they had like developed this like underarm thermometer for pets
Okay.
that they've had like a lot of success with, and I've seen them like all over the place.
Actually, I might have seen it go by. I might have. I'm not so familiar. Would be like in the most like I looked at their website once.
Okay.
In that sense.
Yeah. Well, I guess my question is because I was thinking, because you're talking about these challenges, these different areas, but here's a device that just sits under the arm, like of the pet. So how are they able to get accurate readings that way?
Yeah. So I'm not familiar with. Like I said, I probably looked at the
Right.
website.
Yeah.
once.
Yeah.
I'll pull it
Generally
up.
speaking,
So
assumptions.
we
Yeah.
do this with normal rectal thermometers, and then usually it's kind of at a degree. So it could be as simple as that. I would want to read, of course, before commenting.
Gotcha.
But I will tell you right now, sorry, I didn't mention, I have classical epidemiology training, so that's where all this comes together. I would, of course, look at the study and sort of say, like, if it really truly was as easy as like a thermometer that's mass produced and we use everywhere, and you just have to sort of compensate in the software for it. I mean, if it's that simple, why would I do anything else?
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
But to their point, that they say the world's first accurate underarm pet thermometer, if they're doing it in the software instead of you having to either add a degree, or I note in the record it was axial, or God bless, I bet a bunch of vets just write the temperature. And then mostly we're seeing healthy pets, for the most part, in GP practices. So as long as you're not wildly up, wildly down, if it's even off by a degree.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
Hard to say that it matters clinically. Now, if you're interested in mining this data and looking for trends and saying, associations, then you might care quite a bit more. But I'll look into it.
Well, yeah, because you were just talking about the challenges with like the hair and stuff. So then it had me thinking, like, well, how does this damn thing work, right? Like, how are they having success with that? Interesting.
Yeah, especially if they can do this quickly, because when we take the rectal thermometer and we put it under the arm like that, you're there for quite a long time. So it's one of the nice things. Folks use ear thermometers a lot, which have pros and cons. Again, if you're really just saying, are you wildly high, wildly low, they're probably just fine, but they're very operator dependent. And if you're not hitting the tympanic membrane exactly, you're going to get an inaccurate value, but they go in a second, and this probably like 30 seconds, but I mean, imagine how long 30 seconds is if you're, I don't want to say trying to get your rodeo belt buckle, but animals don't always enjoy restraint. And of course, if we're trying to be fear-free, and not make them hate going to the vet, holding them, even though they're not hurt, but just being held for, tens of seconds is very aversive.
Interesting. Danny, you need to have a conversation with her about like real medical data and like cool things you can do. She's the one to talk to you. I'm the industry guy. Like, you should be talking to Rachel. Yeah.
I think we're on the way to a good part 2. That's what I'm thinking. And I have a lot of questions as well, but we could go on forever. So I want to wrap up at least maybe the recording with this and tell everyone thank you for joining. Clint, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for your time. Like I said, I greatly appreciate it. It's the most valuable thing in the world you can give me. So thank you for being willing to share that. And Rachel, thank you for giving your insights and the whole medical side of things. Yeah, like I have no expertise there, so I really appreciate it. Yeah. And
I put some links in the chat just so we could all stay connected. I put Clint's LinkedIn and website, and I put Celeritas' LinkedIn and my LinkedIn, and I hope we can all stay connected. I hope there can be a part 2 to this conversation, but with that, thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you next month.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.